The coastal town of Halcyon Bay was a place where time seemed to slow, where the scent of salt water mingled with the whispers of history. Quaint antique shops lined cobblestone streets, and the tide's steady rhythm was a soothing soundtrack to daily life. Yet, at the edge of this serene town, standing sentinel over restless waves and wind-swept cliffs, was Marigold Manor, a sprawling, once glorious estate wrapped in ivy and shadow, a monument to a legacy steeped in power and secrets. Eleanor Whitmore was the undisputed queen of this world, a woman whose name was uttered with equal parts reverence and fear. She was a titan in publishing, a self-made empire builder whose sharp mind had carved an empire from dust and ambition. Tall and commanding in her prime, Eleanor's presence filled every room she entered, her voice sharp as a scalpel, her gaze piercing and unyielding. But power had come at a cost. Then, almost overnight, silence claimed her. It was a late autumn afternoon when Eleanor's world changed forever. A stroke, a cruel and sudden thief, struck her with a merciless hand. The vibrant woman who once held boardrooms in thrall, who dictated terms with a single glance, was reduced to a fragile shell, paralyzed on one side, her voice slurred into near silence, her fierce spirit trapped within a body that no longer obeyed. She became a prisoner in Marigold Manor, a place now more mausoleum than home. Her children, Sterling, Camille, and Darren, did not rally around her. The three siblings, each shaped by their own desires and disappointments, drifted away like leaves scattered by an indifferent wind. Sterling, the high-profile surgeon with a reputation for precision and cold detachment, buried himself in his hospital work, convinced that presence could be measured only in achievements. Camille, once the radiant socialite, now clung desperately to the flickering embers of her fading celebrity, her time consumed by photo shoots and public appearances. Darren, the youngest, a tech entrepreneur whose ambitions burned quietly beneath a veneer of charm, was already building worlds far beyond the reach of his mother's fading influence. Excuses filled the void where love once lived. Too busy, too painful, too complicated. But beneath the polished veneers, the truth was darker. They were waiting for Eleanor's final breath, eager for the fortune they believed was theirs by right, indifferent to the woman behind the empire. Inside Marigold Manor, Eleanor's days slipped by in silence. The grand halls echoed with the quiet footsteps of the hospice nurse, Evelyn Trent, a woman who became Eleanor's sole companion in those final months. Evelyn, with her soft voice and gentle hands, witnessed the slow unraveling of a woman who had once been untouchable. Rumors whispered through the town like the tide's ceaseless pulse. Eleanor was hiding something deeper than the millions she had amassed. A secret locked away in her dimming eyes. A final message that no one yet understood. Outside, Halcyon Bay watched with bated breath. The town knew the stories, the whispered family feuds, the broken promises, the frost that had settled between Eleanor and her children. The mansion stood like a dark crown, its windows staring like hollow eyes, reflecting a legacy fractured by ambition and abandonment. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the woman who ruled Marigold Manor with iron will, now reduced to fragile silence. "She's paying them back," some said. Others wondered if the stroke had stolen more than Eleanor's voice. Had it also silenced the carefully guarded secrets she kept locked in the heart of the manor? But Eleanor's silence was not surrender. It was the calm before a storm no one saw coming. Inside that house, beyond the faded portraits and heavy curtains, the embers of a plan burned quietly. A plan crafted not by the children who had forsaken her, but by the woman who had built her empire on control and cunning. Though her voice was gone, her mind remained sharp, her final moves poised to rewrite everything. And in the shadows of Marigold Manor, the stage was being set. For when Eleanor Whitmore finally spoke again, it would be with the echo of a reckoning. To Halcyon Bay on that fateful afternoon seemed almost symbolic, a dark, brooding mirror to the turmoil brewing within the walls of Marigold Manor. Heavy rain hammered the slate roof, wind howled through the ancient oaks lining the driveway, and the sea churned like a restless beast just beyond the cliff's edge. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, anticipation, and a bitterness that clung to the air like damp fog. Eleanor Whitmore's death had pulled her 3 children back to the house they had all but abandoned. Sterling, Camille, and Darren, 3 lives carved by their own ambitions and resentments, stood side by side yet miles apart, each hiding a world of secrets behind carefully composed expressions. Sterling arrived first, stepping out of his sleek black sedan with the cold precision of a surgeon entering the operating room. His crisp suit was immaculate, but his face bore the strain of years spent suppressing emotions, a man who had learned to bury vulnerability beneath layers of control. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight, but he wore the mask of dutiful son and heir with practiced ease. Camille followed, her entrance a stark contrast. Draped in designer silk, she moved with a practiced grace born from years in the spotlight. But beneath the flawless exterior, her eyes flickered with nerves, a fragile star fighting the inevitable dimming of her fame. She was used to being the center of attention, yet here, in the shadow of death and loss, she seemed smaller, uncertain, a woman battling a storm she hadn't learned to weather. Last came Darren, the youngest and least understood. Casual in his demeanor yet sharp as a tack, he paced the grand foyer with restless energy. His eyes darted to his siblings, reading their every move, calculating, waiting. Where Sterling and Camille wore armor, Darren moved like a man holding secrets close, his charm a veil for something deeper, something unspoken. The 3 siblings gathered in the grand parlor, a room that had once hosted celebrations and family gatherings, now cold and suffused with the heavy scent of old wood and unspoken grief. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors who had built this empire, their painted gazes seemingly judging the living who now gathered beneath their watch. Gerald Langley, the family's long-serving lawyer, entered with the weight of decades etched into his features. His usual calm was tempered by a solemnity that sent a ripple of unease through the room. In his hands, he carried the leather-bound will, an artifact of legacy and law that would decide the fate of the Whitmore dynasty. As the storm raged outside, Gerald's voice cut through the silence, steady but grave. "My Lady Eleanor left instructions," he began, "and the contents of her will are unlike anything we have seen before." Sterling's gaze hardened. Camille clutched her purse tighter. Darren's fingers drummed restlessly on the arm of his chair. The air crackled with anticipation, but beneath it all was something more dangerous. Old wounds reopening, family fractures exposed. When Gerald revealed the distribution of Eleanor's estate, the room seemed to hold its breath, and then shock. The bulk of Marigold Manor, the publishing empire, the investments, and the fortune, they were not bequeathed to her children. Instead, the assets were divided among 5 unknown beneficiaries, names unfamiliar and strange, some accompanied by cryptic notes: "The girl I never knew how to love," "the son of a forgotten housemaid," and 2 former interns praised for their kindness. A palpable silence fell. Sterling's eyes narrowed into icy slits. Camille's face drained of color. Darren's restless tapping ceased. Each sibling grappled with a bitter, burning disbelief. Questions flooded the room. Who were these people? Why had Eleanor ignored her blood in favor of strangers? Had she truly abandoned her children, as they had abandoned her? Or was this some elaborate test? One final puzzle designed to unearth the truth beneath years of silence and neglect? Before the lawyer could continue, a hush fell over the room. Gerald produced a sealed red envelope, its wax emblem cracked but still intact. It was marked with an instruction that sent a chill through the siblings. It was to be opened last, and only in their joint presence. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, as Gerald peeled open the envelope and began to read Eleanor's final words aloud, words heavy with accusation, regret, and a cold, calculated vengeance. You left me in silence when all I wanted was your voices. You left me to die when all I needed was your presence. But death has a voice louder than your selfish ambitions, and I will use it." The siblings sat frozen, the weight of Eleanor's condemnation hanging in the air like a thick fog. No longer were they children waiting for an inheritance. They were accused, judged, and stripped bare before their mother's final haunting voice. The red envelope contained more than just a letter. Hidden within its folds was a clause, a cruel ultimatum buried in legal language. If any of the siblings spoke ill of Eleanor in public or contested the will within 30 days, they would lose even the personal mementos left to them. But if they remained silent, a second inheritance would be theirs, to be revealed only after the waiting period. The storm outside seemed to echo the chaos inside Marigold Manor, wild, unpredictable, and filled with the promise of a reckoning none of them were prepared for. As the reading ended, Sterling, Camille, and Darren exchanged glances, each silently wondering who among them would break first. The game had begun. The storm outside raged with relentless fury, as if nature itself were protesting the revelations inside Marigold Manor. The heavy rain battered the tall windows, and gusts of wind rattled the ancient walls. Inside the grand parlor, the atmosphere was thick with disbelief and tension, every breath weighted with shock. Gerald Langley, the seasoned family lawyer, carefully unfolded the pages of the will that had upended everything the Whitmore siblings thought they knew about their mother and their future. Instead of the expected declarations of wealth passed down to Sterling, Camille, and Darren, Eleanor Whitmore's final wishes carved an entirely different path. The lion's share of her vast fortune, the sprawling Marigold Manor, and the publishing empire she had built were entrusted not to her children, but to 5 unfamiliar names, people no one in the room recognized. The first name on the list was Lillian Cross, described simply as the girl I never knew how to love. The phrasing was cryptic, almost haunting. Who was this Lillian? A daughter Eleanor never claimed? A secret kept in the shadows? The mere suggestion sent a shiver through the gathered family. Then there was Marco Reyes, listed with a sparse address and a note identifying him as the son of Eleanor's long-lost housemaid from decades ago. His inclusion seemed a stark departure from the usual cold, calculating distributions typical of Eleanor's reputation. What bonds had tied Eleanor to this forgotten servant's child? What debts or affections did she honor in secret? The other 2 beneficiaries were former interns from Eleanor's publishing company. Young individuals lauded in the will for their kindness, their integrity, and their ability to see beyond titles and money. The language was almost tender, a surprising warmth in the cold, legal document. Eleanor, who had been known for ruthless business acumen, was now rewarding those who showed simple human decency. The siblings sat frozen, absorbing the magnitude of the betrayal, or perhaps justice. Sterling's jaw clenched, his surgeon's precision unable to sever the growing knot of rage and confusion. Camille's fingers trembled as she gripped the armrest, trying to mask the storm inside. Darren's eyes flickered with a mix of calculation and something softer, something almost like regret. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. None could speak first. None wanted to voice the words that clawed at their throats. Why had their mother disinherited them? Why had she given away the empire they'd been raised to inherit? Gerald cleared his throat, the only sound besides the rain and distant thunder. Ms. Whitmore's instructions were clear, he said carefully. These 5 individuals were chosen not at random, but with intention. In her own words, they represent the fragments of my life I could not protect, the kindness I valued, and the love I never received. That phrase hung in the air like a challenge. A sudden burst of questions flooded the room. Who was Lillian Cross? Was she a daughter born in secret, a niece, or a ghost from Eleanor's past? How had Marco Reyes come to capture Eleanor's attention after so many years? Were the interns truly worthy, or were they convenient tokens in a greater scheme? Sterling's voice finally broke the silence, low and sharp. This is a betrayal, a calculated insult. Mother never forgave us, did she? Camille's eyes flashed with bitterness. Or maybe she just never loved us enough to keep us. Darren remained quiet, but inside, a storm brewed. He understood the stakes now weren't just money. They were about legacy, about truth, about something his siblings couldn't yet see. Then, Gerald reached into the folds of the will and pulled out a small, sealed red envelope, the final piece of Eleanor's posthumous puzzle. The room went still once more, the weight of expectation pressing down hard. "This envelope," Gerald explained, "is to be opened last, and only in the presence of all 3 Whitmore children." The envelope's wax seal was cracked but intact, the deep crimson a stark contrast against the pale paper. With trembling hands, Gerald broke the seal and began to read aloud Eleanor's final words, words that cut through the room like a blade. "You left me in silence when all I wanted was your voices. You left me to die when all I needed was your presence. But death has a voice louder than your selfish ambitions, and I will use it." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of Eleanor's condemnation. No longer were they heirs. They were accused children, abandoned and found wanting. Their mother's voice, though nearly silenced in life, now rang louder than ever, echoing through the manor and their consciences. The revelation of the will and its beneficiaries was more than a shock. It was a reckoning. The Whitmore siblings were forced to confront not only the loss of their mother, but the loss of the legacy they had expected to claim without question. And as the storm outside began to wane, the siblings sat in the heavy silence, each wrestling with their own ghosts, and with the knowledge that their mother's final intentions were more complicated and more personal than any of them could have imagined. The grand parlor of Marigold Manor seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the storm's fury had softened to a steady patter against the tall, ancient windows, but inside, a tempest of a different kind raged. The siblings, Sterling, Camille, and Darren, sat rigid, their eyes locked on the small, crimson envelope resting on the heavy oak table like a silent challenge. Gerald Langley, the family lawyer, regarded the envelope with a solemn respect that hinted at the gravity contained within. He had served the Whitmore family for over 3 decades, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and now stood at the precipice of the final act in Eleanor Whitmore's long and complicated story. With deliberate care, Gerald broke the wax seal, the faint snap echoing through the hushed room. Slowly, he unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thick and aged, Eleanor's familiar, elegant handwriting sprawling across the page. His voice, usually steady and unflappable, wavered ever so slightly as he read aloud the words of a mother scorned, a woman betrayed by her own flesh and blood. "You left me in silence when all I wanted was your voices. You left me to die when all I needed was your presence. But death has a voice louder than your selfish ambitions, and I will use it." The weight of those words settled like a stone on every heart present. Sterling's jaw tightened. Camille's hands trembled in her lap. Darren's gaze darkened, unreadable. The accusation was raw, cutting through the veneer of civility that had barely masked years of neglect and resentment. But the letter was only the prelude to the true sting. Gerald cleared his throat and continued, revealing the final clause carefully embedded within the legal language of the will. "If any of my children contest this will or speak ill of me in public, through the press, social media, or any other means, within 30 days of this reading, they shall forfeit even the smallest personal items left to them. Trinkets, heirlooms, sentimental keepsakes, everything will be reclaimed. However, if they choose silence, reflection, and respect during this time, I shall grant them a second inheritance. A gift to be revealed exactly 30 days from this reading, in sealed envelopes held by my lawyer, to be opened only if this condition is met." The room was struck dumb. The siblings exchanged wary, uncertain glances. A game had begun, one they had not anticipated. Camille's voice finally broke the silence, sharp with disbelief. "She's blackmailing us from beyond the grave." Sterling's eyes flickered with cold resolve. "It's a test, a way to make sure we're worthy. Or maybe just a final punishment." Darren, quiet until now, leaned forward, his fingers steepled. She wants control, even now, even after death. The lawyer's warning was clear. Any misstep, any words spoken in anger or defiance to the world, and their remaining scraps would vanish. But patience might be rewarded with a mysterious second inheritance, one that promised to change everything. As the siblings departed the manor that evening, the storm had finally begun to break. Yet inside their minds, the tempest was only just beginning. For the next 30 days, silence became a weapon and a shield. The media circled like vultures, hungry for a scandal, while friends and foes alike whispered and watched, waiting for a crack in the facade. Old wounds reopened as suspicions grew. Camille suspected Sterling of hiring private investigators. Sterling suspected Camille of plotting to leak damaging stories. Darren watched them both, his own secrets tightly guarded, wondering who would break first. Each day stretched longer than the last, filled with uneasy quiet and the invisible pressure of Eleanor's words echoing in their minds. The siblings were no longer just heirs. They were players in a psychological war of endurance. Meanwhile, the mysterious beneficiaries Eleanor had named, the strangers who now held the keys to her empire, loomed like shadows over the family's fractured legacy. Who were they really? What had Eleanor seen in them that her own children lacked? As the 30th day approached, the Whitmore siblings were left with more questions than answers, and a single, looming truth. Eleanor's final message was not just about money. It was about reckoning, about judgment, and about the cost of neglecting the one person who had given them everything. And somewhere in the dark corners of Marigold Manor, Eleanor's silence was no longer empty. It was alive, waiting to speak again. The moment the red envelope was read, a new kind of silence fell over the Whitmore siblings, not the kind born of grief or reflection, but of pressure. Dense, suffocating, strategic. The countdown had begun. 30 days. 30 excruciating days of enforced silence, demanded not by a living matriarch, but by a ghost wielding her will like a dagger from the grave. 30 days to remain mute in the face of public curiosity, tabloid scrutiny, and their own festering resentment. To the outside world, it looked like grace, dignity. 3 grieving children choosing solemnity in the wake of loss. But behind closed doors, it was war. Each sibling retreated to their own corner of the world, Sterling to his Manhattan penthouse, Camille to her glossy LA townhouse, and Darren to his minimalist tech compound just outside Seattle. Yet distance only sharpened the paranoia. Their minds became battlegrounds, looping with questions Eleanor had left unanswered, and suspicions that multiplied with each passing hour. What was in the second inheritance? Why require their silence? And, most importantly, could they trust each other to keep it? In her silence, Eleanor had transformed her children into prisoners of their own ambition. The media, of course, didn't care about stipulations or clauses. The Whitmore family drama was front-page gold. News vans camped outside their homes. Columnists dissected body language from funeral footage. Paparazzi chased Camille down sidewalks, hoping for a single quote, a single slip. She came closest to cracking first. Camille had always lived for the spotlight. Her fame, though fading, had once been her armor. But now, in the quiet, there was nothing to distract her from the truth, that her mother had seen her not as a daughter, but as a disappointment. Her mansion, once alive with stylists and photographers, was now eerily still. Every room echoed with memories she wasn't sure were real anymore. Late at night, she'd stare at her phone, her thumb hovering over Instagram, aching to post something. Anything. Even a cryptic quote. But Eleanor's warning rang in her ears. If you speak of me, you lose everything. Sterling, meanwhile, retreated into the cold efficiency of his work. He operated on brains by day and sharpened his bitterness by night. He told himself he didn't care, that Eleanor's empire was irrelevant. But the truth was more corrosive. He had cared. Deeply. And now he felt like a fool for it. Behind the facade, he began consulting legal experts in secret, looking for loopholes, backdoors, technicalities in the language of the will. Perhaps, he thought, if he didn't speak to the media but allowed something to leak through a third party, no too risky. Eleanor had anticipated every angle. Still, the thoughts gnawed at him. And Darren watched. He didn't hire lawyers, he didn't call press, he didn't post, he observed. He knew Sterling would be methodical, calculating his every move. And he knew Camille was fraying by the day. He suspected one or both would slip, whether by vanity or pride. So Darren stayed quiet. Not just because Eleanor demanded it, but because he needed to understand her final move. Why him? Why now? Then, the packages began to arrive. One by one, over the course of a week, anonymous deliveries appeared at each sibling's doorstep. Each contained a carefully curated reminder of their childhood, items that hadn't been seen in decades. A photograph of Camille as a child, clinging to Eleanor's leg at a garden party. An audio tape of Eleanor singing an old lullaby she used to hum when Sterling was sick. A torn journal page filled with a trembling scrawl that read, "Why don't they visit me?" These weren't random. They were surgical strikes. Emotional warfare. Someone was playing Eleanor's game from the shadows, or Eleanor herself had planned this descent into madness. It was impossible to tell which was worse. Camille broke into tears upon receiving her package and locked herself in her room for 2 days. Sterling smashed the tape recorder against a wall. Darren didn't react at all, at least not on the outside. But inside, they were unraveling. By the 3rd week, Camille began calling her PR team, asking what would technically qualify as a, quote, public statement. Sterling had his lawyer on standby. Darren began receiving anonymous text messages asking if he'd be willing to, quote, share his side. Someone was testing their resolve. Someone was pushing them toward the edge. And through it all, Marigold Manor remained silent. Watching, waiting. 30 days. It seemed like a simple challenge. Say nothing, do nothing, let time pass. But Eleanor had understood them far too well. She knew her children wouldn't fill the silence with reflection. They would fill it with suspicion, and that would prove more dangerous than any headline. In the days following the will reading, Eleanor Whitmore's absence began to take on a strange, almost supernatural weight. Though her body was gone, buried in the private family plot just beyond the cliffs of Marigold Manor, her presence only seemed to grow stronger. At first, it was subtle. A stray memory, a dream, a flicker of scent. Her perfume, white iris, drifting inexplicably through closed rooms. Camille dismissed it as stress. Sterling blamed poor sleep. Darren, however, noticed something different. These weren't mere echoes of grief. They were orchestrated. Then came the packages. Each sibling received theirs at different times, always hand-delivered, always unmarked. Camille's arrived first. A cream-colored box resting on her doorstep late one morning, after a sleepless night of pacing. She opened it slowly, suspiciously, expecting a gift from a fan or a trap from the press. Inside, she found a photograph. It was a candid Polaroid, aged and sun-faded, of her, no older than 6, curled in Eleanor's lap beneath the willow tree behind the manor. Her face was flushed with tears, but Eleanor was mid-laugh, holding her close, brushing her hair back with a tenderness Camille hadn't remembered in years. Pinned to the photo was a note, 5 words, written in Eleanor's unmistakable script. "You were never a burden." Camille sat down in the doorway and wept, the kind of cry that comes not from sadness but from shame. Sterling's came next, delivered to the nurse's station at the hospital where he worked, sealed in a plain manila envelope. Inside was a cassette tape, and with it a small handheld player. He almost threw it away. But curiosity won. He listened to it alone in the quiet of his office. A soft static gave way to Eleanor's voice, not stern, not commanding, but soft. She was singing a lullaby. The Ash Grove, the old Welsh tune she used to hum when he was ill as a child. Her voice cracked in places, wavering with age and frailty, but unmistakably her. He remembered lying fevered on a velvet couch in Marigold's sunroom, her cool hand on his brow, that song carrying him into sleep. The tape ended with silence, and then, faintly, barely audible, Eleanor's voice. "You were always my son, even when you made yourself a stranger." Sterling stared at the wall for hours, tape still in hand. Darren's delivery was the most haunting. No note, no envelope, just a bound journal, placed on his desk overnight. Inside, page after page, written in shaky, faltering handwriting, Eleanor's private thoughts during her final year. Confessions of loneliness, terror, confusion, rage, and longing. She wrote about each of them by name, pleading for their visits, wondering if they hated her, asking the void if she had done something unforgivable. And one line, written repeatedly across a full page like a penance: "They'll only understand when it's too late." Darren closed the journal with trembling hands, heart pounding. None of them spoke to one another about the deliveries, but each suspected the others had received something similar. And though they didn't know it yet, the impact was the same. Eleanor had reached out from beyond the veil to wrap her fingers around their guilt, squeezing. But Eleanor wasn't done. In the nights that followed, strange things began happening. Lights flickered in the halls of Marigold Manor, despite the home being locked and unoccupied. The groundskeeper, Jonah, claimed he saw Eleanor's silhouette through the upstairs window. Evelyn, the private nurse who had cared for her, began receiving blank phone calls from Eleanor's old study line, a number disconnected since her death. At first it was chalked up to coincidence, grief, static in the mind. But Halcyon Bay had always been a town full of watchers, and the whispers started again. Eleanor never truly left, they said. She was too proud to die quietly. She's punishing them, one by one. The press couldn't catch it. Cameras failed to capture the flickers in the windows. But the siblings felt it, in the quiet creak of stairs, in the scent that lingered in empty rooms, in the weight of Eleanor's judgment pressing in. By the fourth week of silence, Eleanor had become more powerful than she had ever been in life, not through fear, not through business, but through memory. Regret. Love twisted by years of distance and silence, and still the question loomed larger than ever. Was this part of her plan, or was someone, taking justice into their own hands? Each sibling began to wonder if they were being watched. Not by the media, not even by each other, but by their mother, waiting, listening, judging. For 28 days, Camille Whitmore held it together, or so the world believed. She wore grief-like couture, elegantly tailored, impeccably presented. Black silk dresses and oversized sunglasses became her uniform. She gave no interviews, posted no selfies, and for once, her name wasn't trending for a scandal or a wardrobe malfunction, but for silence. Respectful, mournful silence. But what the world didn't see was the unraveling behind the lens. Camille wasn't built for quiet. Her life had been a performance from the moment she could speak. Eleanor used to dress her up like a porcelain doll at charity galas, showcasing her as the perfect daughter. Later, Camille did the same for herself, turning beauty and charisma into currency. In front of flashing cameras, she had power. Attention equaled worth. But now there was only stillness. And guilt. And ghosts. The package Eleanor had sent, the photograph with the words, "You were never a burden," played on a loop in Camille's mind. She tried to dismiss it, tried to tell herself it was a manipulation, a guilt trip. But it felt too real, too raw. She remembered that day in the garden. The scraped knee, the sobbing. The way Eleanor, just for a moment, had softened. Not the towering figure of ambition and discipline, but just a mother holding her daughter. Had she misremembered her whole childhood? Had she painted Eleanor as a villain to cope with the pain of feeling unseen? Camille began to spiral. She stopped returning calls from her agent, avoided her influencer friends who only wanted the scoop. She turned mirrors to face the wall, unable to look herself in the eye. And then came the dream. Eleanor, sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, hair pinned perfectly, wearing that pearl gray suit she always wore to business meetings. Camille was 8 again, hiding under the covers, crying after a ballet recital where she'd missed a step. In the dream, Eleanor didn't scold her. She simply said, "You always needed more than I knew how to give." Camille woke up gasping, tears on her cheeks. It was the first time she'd cried in weeks, maybe months. By day 29, the pressure was unbearable. The paparazzi had caught wind of the deliveries. They didn't know what was in the packages, but they knew something had changed. Camille was no longer attending events. She was disappearing. And silence, for someone like her, was a spotlight of its own. That night, she broke. She walked into a small bar off Sunset, hood up, sunglasses still clinging to her face like armor. She ordered 3 drinks in rapid succession. By the 4th, the memories became voices. Eleanor's. Her own. The fight they'd had 2 years ago when Eleanor accused her of being nothing more than a brand. She hated how much it still hurt. When the camera flash came, Camille didn't notice. Not until the woman approached her, microphone in hand, phone already recording. "Camille, do you think your mother would have been proud of the will?" It was instinct. Decades of training. Camille looked into the lens and said with a shaky laugh and glossy eyes, "Proud? My mother never felt pride for anyone but herself." It spread like wildfire. Within hours, her face was everywhere. Grainy footage of a woman unraveling, her mascara smudged, voice breaking, honesty leaking through cracked glamour. She trended for all the wrong reasons. #Whitmore breakdown. #cruel hair. Back at Marigold Manor, Gerald Langley received the footage via email from an anonymous source. He watched it only once. Then, with a heavy sigh, he moved Camille's envelope, sealed and unopened, from the vault to a drawer marked forfeited. The will's clause had been activated. There would be no second inheritance for Camille Whitmore. In her attempt to reclaim her voice, she had lost the only thing her mother had left her. Yet for Camille, something else had shifted. When she awoke the next morning, hungover and hollow, there was a strange lightness to the pain. She had spoken her truth. Finally, without a script, without a spotlight. For better or worse, it was hers. And somewhere, in the unseen corners of Marigold Manor, the ghost of Eleanor Whitmore, proud or disappointed, remained silent. Watching. Waiting. For who would fall next? By the time news of Camille's emotional collapse reached Sterling Whitmore, he was already 5 steps ahead. He read the headline, "Heiress Meltdown, Camille Whitmore lashes out at mother," with a sigh, not of sympathy, but of inevitability. He had predicted this. Camille was emotional, impulsive, ill-suited for long games. Her fall was not tragic, it was useful. Now, the board had one less player, and Sterling saw only opportunity. He poured himself a glass of scotch in his penthouse office, the lights of Manhattan glittering behind him. He replayed the video of Camille's drunken rant twice, the bitterness in her voice, the tears, the slurred accusation. He studied it clinically, the way he might analyze a difficult case file before surgery. Pride, he muttered, always her fatal flaw. His own strategy had been meticulous. No public comments, no interviews. He declined every offer for exclusive insights and turned away every reporter that loitered outside the hospital. But that didn't mean he'd been idle. Behind the scenes, Sterling had been orchestrating his own narrative, a story of closure, healing, and quiet grace. A well-timed charity donation in Eleanor's name. A brief, tasteful memorial page on the hospital website. Subtle touches. Not loud, not confrontational. Just visible. Sterling didn't need to speak ill of his mother. He simply needed the world to see that he had moved on, that he had risen above the chaos. That, unlike Camille, he was composed, controlled. And if that meant bending the rules of Eleanor's will, so be it. He didn't break them. Not technically. But Eleanor had never been one for technicalities. On day 30, Sterling made his move. He held a small, private press conference at the hospital. No grand declarations. No morning veil. Just a crisp, navy suit, polished words, and the calculated calm of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. I want to thank everyone for respecting our family's privacy these past few weeks, he said into the sea of cameras. My mother and I, we had our differences, but she gave me the discipline to become who I am today. I forgive her for the past, and I hope she found peace. There was a murmur of approval. The press called it mature. Gracious. A son healing the wounds of legacy. But Eleanor's will was not impressed. Gerald Langley saw the footage that same evening, sent directly from the executor team monitoring public media. He didn't need to watch it more than once. The language may have been diplomatic, but the implication was clear. Sterling had violated the clause. Forgiveness, Eleanor had written, was not silence. And so, just as Camille's envelope had been moved, Sterling's too was taken from the vault. Labeled. Forfeited. But Sterling didn't know. Not yet. He was at home, sitting beside a low fire, reviewing congratulatory messages from colleagues and media figures who admired his, quote, restraint. In his mind, Eleanor would have appreciated the performance. She always respected control, precision, the clean cut over the messy wound. He assumed the envelope was already on its way to him, tucked into a leather case, accompanied by a personal note from Gerald. He envisioned opening it with a sense of poetic justice. Perhaps Eleanor had left him the publishing house after all, having seen through Darren's quiet, naive loyalty. Instead, it would never arrive. And the moment he'd learn the truth would come days later, when he called Gerald directly, casually, asking when he should expect delivery. There was a pause on the line. Then Gerald's voice, quiet but resolute. Dr. Whitmore, I'm afraid the conditions of the will were not met. The clause was triggered by your public statement. Sterling didn't reply at first. He simply sat back, staring at nothing. Triggered? He repeated. You spoke. You broke the silence. A long pause. And that's enough? He asked, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. It was enough for her. When the call ended, Sterling remained still for a long time. The fire had died to embers. The city outside bustled with its usual noise, oblivious to the man who had just realized he'd miscalculated the final move in a game he thought he was winning. For all his precision, he had underestimated Eleanor one last time, and now the empire he believed should have been his was gone. Day 30 arrived like the slow rising of a storm, not with lightning, not with chaos, but with a stillness so sharp it hummed in the air. Darren Whitmore stood alone in the cavernous foyer of his penthouse, a single light on, the windows yawning open to a gray, quiet Seattle skyline. No press. No reporters. No theatrics. The world had all but forgotten he existed, just as he liked it. But Eleanor had not forgotten him. He'd received a message early that morning. Simple, direct. From Gerald Langley. The time has come. I'll see you at noon. And now, as the clock struck 12, Gerald stepped inside. He wore his usual charcoal gray suit, a leather briefcase clutched in one gloved hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were softer than they had been a month ago, perhaps even tinged with respect. Without a word, Gerald opened the case. Inside was a single, sealed envelope, white, with Darren's name written in Eleanor's elegant, sloping handwriting. Gerald placed it on the table between them. You're the only one, he said simply. Camille and Sterling both disqualified. Darren didn't gloat. He didn't smile. Instead, he just stared at the envelope, heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He reached out, slowly, and opened it. Inside were two things: a legal deed and a folded letter. The deed was unmistakable, the transfer of full ownership of Marigold Manor. But not just the house. Darren now controlled the majority stake in Whitmore Publishing, Eleanor's global empire. The board would answer to him now. The legacy, the fortune, the name, it was all his. But the letter was the real inheritance. He opened it with trembling fingers. Darren, you were never born of my blood, but you were born of my decision. I chose you. I raised you. I feared you. I loved you. Not as I should have. Not always with warmth, but always with weight. You were the one who stayed. When my body failed and my voice vanished, you were the only one who visited without cameras or contracts. You didn't come for my money. You came because you still believed I was worth something, even if I had never believed it myself. The truth is this: you are not my son by blood. Your mother was a woman named Marigold. She loved a married man, my husband. She died in childbirth, and I, in a moment of fury and grief and impossible silence, took you in. You were supposed to be a reminder of betrayal. Instead, you became the one person who never betrayed me. That is why everything I built, my house, my company, my legacy, belongs to you. Because you are the only one who proved worthy of the cost it took to build it. They will never understand this choice. But maybe you will. Maybe you already do. Use it wisely, Darren. Use it better than I did. I gave the world my name, now I give it to you. Eleanor! The words hit harder than he expected. He'd always felt different. Not quite like Camille and Sterling. Not because of status or success, but something deeper. Something unsettled in his reflection. Now, that feeling had a name, a truth. He had never been a Whitmore by blood. But Eleanor had made him one anyway. Gerald stood quietly as Darren folded the letter. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. After a long moment, Darren whispered, "She planned this. All of it." Gerald nodded once. To the hour. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but reverent. The kind of silence Eleanor would have approved of. Commanding, purposeful. As Gerald departed, he left Darren with the keys to Marigold Manor, the company transfer documents, and a single envelope addressed to the board of directors. Darren was no longer an outsider. He was the heir. And yet, as he stood alone looking down at the letter once more, he felt something strange. Not triumph, not relief, but grief. Not just for Eleanor, or for the family that had shattered around him, but for the version of himself that had always wondered if he was enough, and now had to prove it. Back in Halcyon Bay, the storm had long passed. The cliffs overlooking the sea were calm. Marigold Manor sat quiet, its lights off, its secrets spent, at least for now. But the town buzzed with the news. Darren Whitmore, the bastard son, inherits it all. They whispered about him in cafes and bookstores, speculating on what he'd do next. Would he sell the house, take the company public, rewrite Eleanor's legacy? None of them knew. But somewhere inside the heart of that sprawling, empty estate, a new chapter had already begun, and it was no longer Eleanor's to write. Marigold Manor stood still against the sky, its ivy-covered stone walls whispering stories only the wind could understand. The sea below was calm now. The waves no longer crashed with fury but lapped gently at the cliffs, as if mourning, or perhaps celebrating, the end of an era. Inside the manor, Darren Whitmore wandered its silent halls. They didn't feel like his. Not yet. He passed portraits that stared down at him with eyes painted generations ago. Some were stern, others wore half-smiles. But none looked like him. None shared his blood. And yet, the estate, the fortune, the legacy, they were his now, because Eleanor had said so, because she had chosen him. He paused in the library, the afternoon sun casting long beams across the Persian rug. This room had always felt like the heart of the house. A cathedral of knowledge. A sanctum of control. Eleanor's control. Darren stood by her favorite chair, a wingback of dark emerald velvet. Her reading glasses still rested on the end table beside it, untouched since the day she fell silent. It should have been the end. Camille had been disqualified. Sterling, too. The press had torn them apart in the aftermath, debating who had truly lost and who had simply revealed themselves. Darren hadn't spoken to them. He wasn't sure he ever would. He'd been left with everything. The company, the house, the power. And still, it didn't feel finished. Eleanor was not the kind of woman to go quietly. Her game, her will, her cruel poetry of vengeance had come to its grand finale. But Darren had read enough of her journals to know one thing for certain. Eleanor always left an exit door, and she always left it locked. On a gray Tuesday morning, Gerald Langley received a package. It was slim, wrapped in dark ribbon, and bore no postage. Just one name, written in Eleanor's distinct looping script, to be opened only if Darren ever betrays my trust. Gerald stared at it for a long while before placing it in the back of his office safe. He didn't tell Darren, not yet. But he kept the key on him at all times. Back at the Manor, Darren found himself pulled back to the West Wing, Eleanor's private study. It had been locked since her death, the room sealed per her instructions. Now he stood before it, key in hand. The lock clicked with a tired sigh, and the door opened. The air inside was heavy with dust, but it carried the unmistakable scent of white iris. Her perfume. Her armor. The room was just as she'd left it, meticulous, cold, and orderly. Files lined the cabinets, floor to ceiling. 2 wall safes stood open, empty now. The desk was bare, except for a single item resting at its center. A photograph. Darren picked it up slowly. It was a picture of Eleanor as a young woman, before the publishing empire, before the marriages and the children. She was seated beside another woman, dark-haired, gentle-eyed. They were laughing, holding hands. On the back, a single sentence was written in Eleanor's hand, "The one love I could never name." Darren stared at it for a long moment. A 6th heir? The thought struck him with sudden clarity. The will had named 5 outsiders, but Eleanor had hinted in her journals that there had once been 6. A final name, a final secret. Could this be her? He rifled through the drawers, now with purpose. Notes, letters, journals, names scratched out, one recurring one underlined, L.C. The same initials as Lillian Cross, the woman Eleanor referred to as the girl I never knew how to love. Were they the same? Had Lillian been her daughter? Or something more? The press wouldn't know. The board didn't care. But Darren, he had to understand the truth of the empire he now controlled. Eleanor had built it on secrets, on silence, on sacrifice. And now, even in death, she still held the final card. Darren returned the photo to the desk, heart heavy but resolute. He didn't know what he'd do with what he'd found. Not yet. But he knew this. Eleanor's will was not the last word. It was a threshold. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a small town or under another name, was the 6th piece of the puzzle, the final heir. The story not written, not yet. And in a quiet, darkened office, far from Marigold Manor, Gerald Langley sat at his desk long after the lights had gone out, staring at the unopened envelope Eleanor had left behind. The seal shimmered faintly under his desk lamp, still closed, still waiting. Because Eleanor Whitmore, even in death, did not just leave a legacy. She left a warning. Fade to black.